The big news, the very big news that's happened is the BRICS summit, the expansion of the BRICS. And Alex Christoforou and I had the privilege of doing a program yesterday with Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who was discussing the outcome of the BRICS summit and also China's economic slowdown. And he was making some comparisons with the slowdown that Japan experienced in the 1980s. I should say that I've had some comments from some people, including one particular person who is extremely well informed about these matters and whose views I take extremely seriously, that challenges some of Professor Sachs's views about Japan's economic decline in the 1980s and, by extension, China's problems today. I'm not going to get into that discussion in this program. But what I will say is this. Putting all that aside, and it is an important and interesting topic in itself, and I'm not judging who's right or who's wrong about this because, well, it's something that I don't have the specialist knowledge to comment usefully about. But putting all that aside, the key thing to understand about the BRICS, the latest BRICS summit, is that what we're seeing is a new international trading system, distinct from that controlled by the West, being set up. And Professor Sachs used the extremely interesting word, workaround, that various countries now want to work around the dollar. The dollar, and not just the dollar, but the entire Western trading system. And I think this is indisputable. I think ultimately this is what this is all about. Now, it ought to be said that the United States has had a policy of trying to contain countries that it sees as economic and commercial rivals. It certainly did do this to an extreme degree with the Soviet Union after the Second World War. I remember that during the period known as détente in the 1970s, the Soviets were very keen to establish normal trading relations with the United States. There was talk, by the way, that the Soviets wanted to move towards an export-led economy, exporting manufactured goods. Most people I know are completely unaware of the fact that they'd entered into very detailed discussions with Lockheed about building Lockheed TriStars in this wide-bodied jet at that time in a factory in Voronezh, which were going to be exported to all sorts of places around the world. The Soviets were keen at that time to integrate themselves fully in the Western economy. Of course, the United States saw the Soviet Union as a potential industrial rival and as a geopolitical adversary. And after some consideration of this idea, in the 1970s, basically the barriers went up again. And one can debate what happened with Japan in the 1980s, but there's no doubt at all that Japan came under a great deal of economic pressure from the United States during that period, as I remember from myself. And recently, in the last few years, we've seen the same thing happen with China. The United States is now purposefully acting to prevent China's economic development. We can see this happening on an increasing, evolving scale. It's trying to block exports of high technology goods to China. It's imposing tariffs on Chinese trade. It's trying to put pressure on American businesses to disinvest from China. It's trying to block investment in China. And, of course, all of this coming on top of the massive attack on Russian trading systems, the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, the massive sanctions on Russia, the ousting of Russia from the dollar system, the seizure of Russia's central bank reserves, or at least the attempted seizure of Russia's central bank reserves. And so what is happening is that more and more countries, China, Russia, India, all of these others are saying to themselves, this is impossible. We cannot hope now to trade on equitable terms with the United States. We cannot use the systems that the United States created in the 1940s at Bretton Woods with the other Western powers, and which have formed the bedrock of the international trading and currency system. What we must do instead is build our own alternatives, not so much in order to overthrow the dollar, but simply so that we can trade effectively with each other, building up our economies, develop markets with each other, create trade patterns with each other, distinct from those ultimately controlled by the United States, which will not expose us to the kind of strangulation pressures that the United States has exerted and is now again trying to exert as it tries to maintain its overall paramountcy over the global economic system. Now, Western response to the decisions made at this BRICS summit has been, to put it mildly, negative. There's been some furious comments I've noticed in particular about Brazil. There's comments about how President Lula of Brazil has somehow let the side down by aligning Brazil with the supposedly criminal regimes of China and Russia. Been some astonishing comments, especially coming out of some people in Germany, which I'm not going to repeat because, to be frank, I find them so over the top that I don't think it's proper if simply to repeat the kind of language that's been used. But the other comments that one has seen is the usual complacent comments from all kinds of people that this is impossible, setting up a separate, distinct trading system from that of the West is unachievable. And there's a long editorial in the Financial Times to that effect today, and it ends with this paragraph: the BRICS may grow, but it is unlikely to achieve much. Plenty of talk, little action, not too different then from some business meetings. Complacency, dripping with complacency, condescension, and not a little arrogance, if I may say, with a peculiarly ill-favoured joke. Little action, including all these new countries, sending out invitations to all of these new countries, talk about setting up financial and trading systems. Little action might not be ultimately successful action, but I can't see how this can be said to be little action. But anyway, there we are. So, are these doubters correct? Well, only time will tell. But Professor Sachs, in that program we did with him on the Duran yesterday, has pointed out that, in fact, the technical obstacles in terms of setting up financial systems, the kind of financial trading systems, are not insuperable by any means, that there are all kinds of things that can be done. What it requires are able technocrats and strong institutions. And the one thing that the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, the others too, are not short of is able technocrats. They can do it. It may take them time. I've seen some suggest that it will take them 5 to 10 years before all of these structures have been fully perfected. But it doesn't mean that we can't see the thing starting to operate to some extent, at least in the meantime, and exerting growing influence as well. And on top of that, should be pointed out that expectations that this summit would be a failure were very widespread in the media before, suggested that China and India were going to be at odds. Turns out that India is fully on board with all of these ideas. And of course, President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi had a meeting in which they appear to have agreed to work harder to diffuse the tensions between them and to try to find some kind of way of easing the tensions on their common border, which had been the long-running problem, which has kept these two great nations at odds with each other. So, it's not impossible. It can be done. And Professor Sachs made the further point, which is that over and above my comments in my programme yesterday, that there'd clearly been some degree of horse trading as to who the new states that would join BRICS would be. All have agreed about the Persian Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Iran and the UAE, but clearly the Russians were keen on Egypt, the Chinese were keen on Ethiopia, the Brazilians wanted Argentina. Probably before long, by the way, I'm going to guess Indonesia will be offered a lot. We might see a new wave of BRICS countries joining the BRICS in the future. Indonesia, Vietnam, perhaps Cuba, perhaps Angola, those kind of states. Anyway, put all that aside. Even as all this is going on, as I said, attempts in the West to pretend that it's not happening, even as we see it happen. I'm going to make one general observation. I think it is probably true in the long term that the world can't have two separate trading systems. The world has operated essentially as a single trading unit since arguably the 16th century. Dividing it up, fracturing it, is really not realistic. When attempts have been made to do so, what eventually happens is that the dominant trading system ultimately absorbs whatever rivals have been set up to itself. To my mind, one way of understanding the collapse of the former Soviet bloc is to understand that that was what happened. The Soviets did try and set up their own trading system amongst their allies through the so-called Council of Mutual Economic Assistance and with the transferable ruble, in rivalry to that of the West, but it was on a minuscule scale compared to that of the West. All of the members of the former Soviet bloc ultimately felt that they needed to trade with the Western economies, and that included the Soviet Union itself, and that set in train a series of processes which led to that bloc completely disappearing. And I can't help but think that sooner or later the same will happen. We have a Western bloc, still led by the United States, using the dollar, built around the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, the old system set up in the 1940s, and then we have the BRICS system in rivalry to it. Sooner or later, one of these will prevail and will absorb the other. The question is, which one? Now, I would put my money for the moment on the BRICS. And the reason I do that is because, well, unlike the situation in the past, they are the biggest producers and traders in real goods. The West used to have that position. It had that position throughout the Cold War. That is why the Soviet bloc was never ultimately an effective rival, and that is why the Soviet bloc failed and why the Western bloc prevailed. Now it is the other way round. It is the Chinese, the Indians, the Russians, the Persian Gulf states, they are the people who produce and make things and who sell real goods and trade them with each other. Now, that's a general point. Of course, it's also true that for the moment at least, this alternative system comes without the political baggage that the Western system does. I'm going to suggest that the great story in the world, the thing that's really going to shape events over the next 10, 20, 30 years will be the struggle between these two emerging economic blocs. Which one of them prevails in the end will be the one that decides the course of future history. And once more, it's essential to say that the catalyst for this event, the single thing that has moved the process, the dial of the process, further and faster than it might either otherwise have gone, that has been the war in Ukraine and the way in which the United States has operated in. So that's what I wanted to say about these momentous events that we are seeing. We are unquestionably at a pivot moment in world history, or so it seems to me. But moving away from these great events, we will see how things develop on the battlefields in Ukraine over the next few days and weeks, what further steps are taken, what happens in West Africa, where ECOWAS has apparently put a force of 12,000 men together in order to try to occupy Niger. That might not be enough, by the way. And we'll see whether the Chinese and the Indians are indeed able to sort out their problems with each other.